For our expert in emotion interview, we'll be speaking with Dr. Ian Gotlib, who's a professor of psychology at Stanford University. In fact, Dr. Gotlib is the David Starr Jordan Professor of Psychology and Director of the Stanford Mood and Anxiety Disorders Laboratory at Stanford University. From 2005 to 2010, Dr. Gotlib served as Senior Associate Dean for the Social Sciences, and he's been Chair of the Department of Psychology at Stanford since 2012. In his research, he broadly examines psychological and biological factors that place individuals at increased risk for depression, as well as processes that are involved in recovery from this disorder. A major goal of Dr. Gotlib's research is to develop a more comprehensive and integrative psychobiological model of the etiology and maintenance of depression. His research is supported largely by grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, and he's also been funded by the National Health Research Development Program, the Medical Research Council of Canada, and the Hope for Depression Research Foundation. He's received numerous awards, including the Distinguished Investigator Award from the National Alliance for Research in Schizophrenia and Affective Disorders, the Joseph Zubin Award for Lifetime Research Contributions to the Understanding of Psychopathology, the APA Award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution, and the APS Distinguished Scientist Award. Dr. Gotlib has published over 450 scientific articles and has written or edited several books in the areas of depression and stress, including the Handbook of Depression with Constance Hammond. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the American Psychopathological Association, and is a past president of the Society for Research in Psychopathology. So I now turn to a very special Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Ian Gotlib on depression and emotion in adolescents. Welcome, Ian. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me, June. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Thank you. So one of the places I thought we could start out with is asking you a bit about what got you interested in emotion in the first place. So where did it all begin for you?
Well, it's interesting, and I appreciate you thinking of me as an emotion researcher. That's probably new-ish for me. I've been doing this, as I'm sure you know, for a long time, and emotion just was not an area of research when I graduated. So I graduated in 1980 and was interested in depression still, but other aspects of depression. So was interested in, at that point, more interpersonal issues. But it became clear that one of the central defining constructs in depression is really dysregulated emotion. Right. And that took a backseat for a long time, given Tim Beck's focus on cognition and the kind of cognitive revolution of the 60s, 70s that bled then into cognitive behavior, and nowhere in that was emotion.
And now, you're regarded as one of the pioneers when we think about emotion and depression. So it's really interesting to hear your evolution of how you got interested in depression and how it sort of led you to cognitive models and how that just naturally bleeds into emotion-related processes too.
Yeah, it's, thank you again. It really is, it's an evolution, and it's really in part following the data for us, for my postdocs, people in my lab, that it's just very clear that emotional functioning is critical. And I think, one of the signs of that, you may know that we've had a Handbook of Depression with Connie Hammond, and we're just starting the third edition of that. We've just organized that. And that's the first time. So the first edition was probably 10 years ago. And this is the first time that we have a chapter on emotion functioning in depression. And I think that that's just, it's now telling how central a role this is becoming.
That's fantastic. So speaking of, what a central emotion in depression is becoming, I wanted to ask you a few questions about your work in this domain.
Of course.
So, your work has really paved the way for our understanding of information processing biases, especially for emotional information in people with depression. And so I wonder, from your perspective, kind of what you see as the signature processes that really characterize individuals with depression here when we think of these biases towards emotional information.
Yeah, this is, we've been working in this area for a while, as have a lot of other people. And in part this started, as you know, in anxiety disorders with Colin McLeod and Andrew Matthews. And there's still a lot of controversy about exactly what are the biases that typify or characterize people with depression. From our perspective, my perspective, I don't want to implicate anybody else. From my perspective, the central issue really is it's an inhibitory deficit. So the simple story for me is that depressed people have difficulty inhibiting the processing of negative stimuli. That when there are, as you know, we're surrounded by stimuli of all valences, positive, negative, threatening. When depressed people encounter stimuli that have a negative valence, sad, even perhaps fearful, but really focus more on the sadness, they cannot stop processing that information. And that information then enters working memory. From that point, they have another difficulty, and that difficulty is expelling that information from working memory. So people who are non-depressed have an active working memory in which information enters, information leaves, it goes into long-term memory, or it's just dumped. Depressed people just hold on to negative information in working memory. They just cannot seem to expel it. Clinically, I think what we see is rumination, and rumination from a cognitive perspective is simply rehearsal of material that's in working memory. And for depressed people, that material seems to be negative. And that accounts for better memory for negative material because of all that extra rehearsal that depressed people turn out to do. It also, as you can imagine, prolongs negative mood, that to keep that material accessible by rehearsal and working memory just makes you feel worse. So I think inhibition is really it's not really a bias so much as it is a process, but it's the best way I think that we've come to understand what's happening cognitively with emotional information with depressed people.
That's really interesting. And from the work you've done and the work you've read of others, do you see these kinds of processes showing distinct patterns when you're looking at adults as opposed to, say, adolescents with depression?
Yeah, we know a lot less about adolescents, about children with depression. It's a relatively new area. Yeah. As you know, there's a huge controversy even in DSM-5 about ADHD, pediatric bipolar disorder. Unipolar depression is not much better off in kids. We've been looking, as you know, to understand depressed processes in depressed kids. We know far less. I think one of the challenges is going to be to integrate what we know about normal child-adolescent development. And we can talk a little bit about that maybe when we talk about some neural processes. Yeah. But there are very distinct maturation temporal sequences of different areas of the brain that really distinguish children and adolescents from adults, in which all of the areas at some point come to be mature.
Yeah, so like you're saying, it's an exciting open area thinking about adolescents and children with depression, and that we know a lot more about adults, especially from a lot of the work you've done. Do you think we're at a point now that we can try to translate these findings, to inform differential diagnosis, development of treatments with specifically cognitive and emotion-related treatment targets? Where are we at that point, you think?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. The diagnosis is it's going to be difficult because diagnosis is simply tied to DSM, and that's a whole other set of videos that you might want to think about starting. At this point, the diagnostic criteria don't really involve, so the emotion that's involved in diagnostic criteria is sadness. But you don't need sadness to get a diagnosis of depression. You can have anhedonia instead, a loss of interest in day-to-day activity. So emotion really hasn't played a role in the diagnostic process. If we maybe extend that question a little bit and say, is there a signature, a cognitive or emotional signature of depression that will distinguish it from other disorders? I think the answer at this point is probably no. And that may be because we just don't know enough about it yet. So there are lots of disorders, in particular anxiety and depression, that are both characterized, as you know, by cognitive biases. And some people have argued that the biases are really the same. It's the content, so threat for anxiety versus sadness or loss for depression. It's a tough literature. It's a tough literature because there are lots of different tasks, and everybody is understandably wanting to be innovative in what they do. And we have some replication difficulties, which is another issue. Journals don't, as we all know, journals don't really reward you for replicating research. So it's just not clear at this stage. And it's worse when we talk about neural function in terms of specificity to depression. So I think inhibitory function is really the best, I think, from my perspective, that we have at this point. It's valenced. There are child disorders that are filtering problems. I mean, filtering is just another way of thinking about inhibition. Schizophrenia, for a long time, when I was in graduate school, there were filter hypotheses of schizophrenia, an inability to filter everything. So schizophrenia was really an overload. ADHD, people have talked about that as an overload condition. So I think we're getting closer, but you can see if it's a Venn diagram, we just have this tiny little center.
A very complicated Venn diagram picture, perhaps.
Yeah, and yeah. I probably misspoke. It's the center that's huge. It's this little depression side that's small.
I mean, and part of the challenge is make it complicated, like you're saying on the one hand, but also in many other ways just leave open a whole possibility of opportunities for people to continue to explore these questions and sort of, probe them from different angles too.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that we haven't done well is to try to understand. So depression is a heterogeneous disorder. There's a lot of ways to get a diagnosis. And what we have not done is to be able to focus on subtypes or even particular symptoms like reward responsivity, anhedonia. Diego Pizzagalli at Harvard has been doing great work on reward processing. And I think that's where we're going to have to start to go, is to understand not depression as an entity, because it's just going to be too complex, heterogeneous, but aspects of depression that may be best explained by theories of emotion.
Yeah. I mean, one other aspect of depression that you've really pioneered is looking into the intergenerational transmission of depression, by examining a parent or mom with depression, and how that relates to their non-depressed, child, often adolescent girls who are at particular risk for developing depression. And I wonder, from this work that you've done, what do you see as the most salient kind of emerging, biological or cognitive or social mechanisms that seem to really pick out these girls who are at greatest risk for developing depression?
Yeah, we've started probably 7-8 years ago a study looking, as you said, at 10 to 14-year-old daughters who have a mother with recurrent episodes of depression. And we ensured that the daughters that we enrolled in the study had, at the time that we enrolled them, had no history of psychopathology. And I have to confess, we thought that we would find, we had a control group of age-matched daughters, again, no history of psychopathology, but no family history either. And what we wanted to do is to get these girls before the onset of an episode of depression. We think probably 50% will develop an episode of depression. Family history is just the strongest single predictor of depression that we know of. We had thought that we wouldn't really find any differences between these two groups of girls, the daughters of depressed and daughters of not depressed mothers, until the daughters started to develop depression years out. And we were really surprised that despite any history of episodes, despite any significant symptoms, in fact, these daughters of depressed mothers are showing biological, cognitive, emotional difficulties that mirror difficulties that we see in depressed adults. So, for example, they are probably most critically, stress reactivity is huge. So they are more reactive to stress challenges. They secrete cortisol, a stress hormone. Um, they secrete higher levels of stress of cortisol. They secrete prolonged levels of cortisol. That cortisol seems to have the effect in the brain of preventing neurogenesis in the hippocampus, in which glucocorticoid receptors, where cortisol is actually binding, is preventing growth of new neurons. So it turns out that, again, despite having no episode of depression yet, these young girls, 10 to 14 years old, have smaller hippocampi than their age-matched, never disordered girls without a history. That cortisol secretion, that's those smaller hippocampi, are actually turning out to predict which of those girls develop an episode of depression. So I think we're trying to understand, and of course that's emotion regulation. I mean, that's really a sense of that stress reactivity is an inability to regulate, not just biologically, although that's what we measured, so that's what we're seeing. I think what we're going to have to do is changing our perception of how we can prevent depression, what we have to focus on. It's one thing to take a group of kids at risk for depression by virtue of a family history, but you can't change family history. You still have to know what's going on, what are the factors that seem to be predicting the onset of depression within that high-risk group. So we've been working on that, and I think emotion and integrating the biology of emotional functioning into that story is going to be important.
I mean, in what way do you see this research, which is just so incredibly important, like you're saying, potentially being able to inform models of risk for, the onset of depression and ways we can potentially intervene preventatively too?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are, one of the other things that we see is that these girls show the same pattern of capture of negative stimuli. Again, despite not having had an episode of depression themselves, we're starting to try prevention approaches with these girls that focus on this dysregulated emotional functioning. We're training some of these girls to try to attend more to positive than to negative stimuli. We're using attentional bias training with these girls. We have another sample of girls in whom we're actually using neurofeedback. We're trying to train these girls to change their pattern of brain activation in response to negative stimuli. They can learn how to do that. It's really something to see. For anyone who was around in the 60s, it's basically biofeedback, but of course we're now doing it from brain signals, brain activation, instead of from finger temperature or muscle feedback. But these girls are learning how to attenuate, how to reduce activation in particular structures in the brain salience network, which is really overactive in depressed adults. And it seems weeks later to make them less reactive to a laboratory stressor. And so that's promising for us. We're following them down the road. Might it delay or even prevent the onset of an episode? It's probably unlikely, given that it's a single intervention point. But if it's that promising, it means that we can develop a prevention around those procedures.
Wow. Amazing work. I'm just really excited to see where that goes. And speaking of, neural mechanisms and processes, I mean, a big part of your work has also been probing some of the neural bases of depression, in both adults and, as you're saying, young adolescent girls at risk for depression. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what is this research really revealing to us, especially when you're looking at the processing of emotional stimuli.
Right. Well, so there's a lot of issues here. One is we were excited. We got in early, probably 1998, so 14 years ago, we started doing brain imaging with depressed adults working with John Gabrielli when John was at Stanford. And it's changed a lot. We're at the point where I think individual studies, although they can be interesting, I think we really need now to look much more at meta-analyses. We have enough research there that it's the only way we're going to get a reliable story. The story, as I mentioned earlier, seems to be that depressed adults seem, in response to an affective challenge, that is to seeing negative stimuli, negative faces, sad or negative IAPS pictures, for example, in the scanner, across a range of studies seem to activate structures like the anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate, the amygdala, that are importantly part of a salience network in the brain. And that seems to be, when you have depressed compared to non-depressed people in studies, those are the structures that most reliably activate in response to negative stimuli. There's a different story with resting state, as people simply lie in the scanner, right? Those are different structures. There we find subgenual anterior cingulate. So the anterior cingulate is it's playing a large role. That's not surprisingly the structure that Helen Mayberg has been targeting for deep brain stimulation, and successfully, although even that research is now moving around in the brain to different structures. But in resting state, there's a strong connectivity, as depressed people lie there compared to non-depressed people, between the anterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex. That's, as you know, where where self-referent processing is centered. And so what you can imagine is this negative affect being generated in the anterior cingulate, being made self-referential in the medial prefrontal cortex. And those are excitatory connectivity. That's excitatory connectivity, so that you get increasing over time, over a 6-minute resting state period, you get increasing connectivity in those two structures. And it's as if they're saying me negative, me negative, me negative. And that connectivity actually correlates with the rumination scores outside the scanner. So, there's a brain basis for negative rumination or depressive-typic rumination that's there constantly. When there are stimuli to be processed, it moves a little bit to different structures, but still limbic activation. And I think it's, as Helen has demonstrated nicely, it's just simply not controlled cortically in the way that it is with non-depressed people.
And do you think this research is at a stage where we can potentially utilize it to identify, biomarkers, so to speak, for depression?
We can use it to identify biomarkers for psychopathology. And the reason I'm hedging is that there's just no evidence that this is unique to depression. We're not there. Depression is a highly comorbid disorder itself. 80% of depressed people will have certainly a lifetime comorbid anxiety disorder diagnosis, and close to 30 to 40% will have a concurrent anxiety disorder diagnosis. So there are only so many structures in the brain, and there are a lot more disorders than structures. And every brain structure is going to be important in pretty much every disorder. So this notion, it's the reason for RDoC. It's the reason for the research domain criteria, is the lack of specificity across DSM disorders. Are they biomarkers for disorder, for illness, for psychopathology, for emotion dysregulation? Yes, absolutely. Can we be as specific as depression versus anxiety? No, not yet.
So then when you think about where the future's headed, and you sort of alluded to this with the RDoC, what do you see as the next most important steps for the field in terms of where its thinking is going to go?
Yeah, to me, that's the what I would call the Wayne Gretzky, where's the puck going to be story, speaking as a Canadian. So I just think it's the $1 million question. So I can talk in generalities first, perhaps. So Speaking in generalities, there's no question that we will not make any progress at all if we continue to be insular in our labs, insular in studying cognitive processes, independent of emotion, independent of neural processes, independent of neuroendocrine, independent of genetics. And I mean, I just think that we need to be collaborative. It's the only way at this point that we're going to make any, I think, significant progress here. So the first thing is integrative research. I think it's the only way we're going to do this. Carefully diagnosed, where DSM-5 is not yet out. As you know, we have probably 6 more months before that hits the newsstands. And once it's out, there's a reason the 5 is Arabic rather than Roman numerals as it was in the past. And it's simply because there's going to then be a 5.1 and a 5.3 and a 5.8 and 6.0. And so this is going to be with us for a long time. And I think we just need to continue to work to get to reduce the heterogeneity of the disorder. So I think the future is going to be with better specification of the disorder, with more integrative assessments, and working from a theory-based foundation as opposed to let's see what happens when you show a face to a depressed person in a scanner.
I mean, that's so interesting. And, you know, when we think about where the future's headed, a big part of that will be students right now that are going to sort of lead and, you know, pioneer the next phase of the field. And as someone who was a former student of yours more than, 10, 12 years ago, I remember coming to your office and asking you for advice about what I should do, where I should spend my time. And I remember you giving me some of the best advice that I still remember to this day. And so I wondered if you might share with a broader audience, what kind of advice do you have for students who are thinking about embarking in the study of, emotion and depression? What should they be doing?
Well, thank you. You're very kind to say that. I'm sure I wasn't the only person who, given where you are now, gave you advice. I think it's important, for me, it's always instructive to remember that I was trained to administer Rorschachs in graduate school. That's my background. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. I would never have thought I would be doing the research I'm doing, certainly when I was in graduate school. And I think that for graduate students, it's hard to look ahead 5 years, never mind 30 years. But this is an incredibly exciting era of research. And I guess my best advice would be to start collaborating early, to start collaborating in graduate school, to go to every single colloquium in your department. Don't just go to colloquia in your area because, again, that's going to keep you insular. If you can go to a colloquium in cognition or a colloquium in neuroscience or a colloquium in immunology and say, what can I learn from this? How can I apply this to my work? And who can I work with? Who can I approach to do this? I think you're well on your way. But to even think, what will I be doing in 10 years? I think you just can't know. Yeah. The field is exploding in a way that it just simply wasn't when I graduated.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Ian. It was a pleasure. I mean, it always is.
Well, June, thank you very much for inviting me. It was great to talk with you like this.
And this concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Ian Gotlib from Stanford University. Thank you again.